Hi everyone. Um, I'm going to start off with something related to what I was covering yesterday on justice and crime, and it's you know nowadays you get that AI generated answer if you type in something to Google, and you have to take it with a little pinch of salt because it's AI. But I typed in just a generic question, and I deliberately made it quite vague and quite not vague but quite um I suppose you could say sensationalist. I typed, "Are Young Offenders Institute soft?" And it came up with, "Oh, this is a complex question." Then I came across an article saying that young offenders themselves think that they are indeed too soft. Now, I should put a caveat to that. It is from some time ago, from 2008, that particular article. It's from a youth research group. Um, but that's quite significant. And it would be interesting if there's some sort of survey done today in young offenders institutes, finding out what the inmates themselves think. Do they think it's too soft? They could get day trips if it's deemed to be part of rehabilitation. Um, I don't know fully what goes on inside those institutions. I'll say probably they're not a complete picnic. I think it would be wrong to say they're completely, like a holiday camp. We have heard of suicides and other problems in those institutions, so it would be wrong to say they're absolutely, a picnic. Um, I say the same thing I say about adult prisons. They shouldn't be barbaric. There shouldn't be a culture, for example, where bullying is allowed to flourish, where an inmate is targeted and so on. But they shouldn't be fun. They shouldn't be easy. In the end of the day, they're there for a reason, that they have done something to innocent people and they're paying a price for it. Now, in this case, cited yesterday, the Ben Coley case, the killer got 7 years. It's too short. Like I say, it should have been 15 to 20 years in my view, but it is what it is. Um, could have been 5 years. So 7 years, that's 2032. I try to think of it, well, yeah, one day inside, it's like 3 days on the outside or something like that. But it is an absolute insult to Mr. Coley's family. It's far too lenient. And like I say, if the public want to do anything about this, it's almost impossible. Because the Court of Appeal makes it deliberately obstructionist. They make it almost impossible to have a case overturned. First of all, they have to deem that it falls under the threshold of being deemed too lenient within the guidelines. And even then, the number of cases that are actually referred are minimal, and those that get overturned are even more minimal. To me, this reiterates the powerlessness that the public have. Now, most people looking at this case will say 7 years for killing a man, 3 years of a rehabilitation order with no custody for filming that murder. It's pathetic. Anyway, this brings me on to a wider subject of populism. Because I think it's fair to say on the subject of crime, I'm populist. My views are popular, that is to say that their views held by most people. Not everyone. There will be people who, do want to focus more on rehabilitation, and they would be of a liberal left persuasion, which tends to be more pro leniency. It almost inevitably is. It's not an insult, it's just an honest observation. Liberal left people tend to be funny about the idea of punishment. It's a reality. Um, if you look at the way people put forward their opinions, someone like myself, who is conservative on crime, first focus is how can the offender pay for what they have done? How can they be held accountable for what they've done? Someone of a liberal left persuasion is more likely to say, it's terrible, how do we rehabilitate them? Now, I say both are important actually. I think the problem with many people in the liberal left when it comes to this particular subject is they want rehabilitation without punishment. I believe in rehabilitation, but I believe it has to be coupled with punishment. How can you get someone to change their ways if they're not first being held accountable for what they've done? I honestly think there's certain guardianistas out there who, if they had their way, they would abolish young offenders institutes altogether. I mean, they would just have none. and young killers would literally be allowed to walk the streets, which is absolutely grotesque. They won't admit that, directly, but if you just need to look at the narrative that they put out. Um, so this gets under the question of populism. Is it a good or a bad thing? I think often it's seen as a bad thing because it's connected with demagoguery. It's connected with some of the most heinous dictators in history. Um, and we know that demagoguery can be a very dangerous thing. It can incite violence. It can cause chaos. Some of the most hideous examples of mass killing in the 20th century started off from demagoguery. So I'm very aware of that. But I'm also convinced that if institutions, let's call it the establishment, don't listen to public anger, and I mean really this, and I don't mean just pay lip service to say, we hear you. I mean act on it. Act on it. I honestly believe that public anger grows. Now, to use last year's riots as an example, I condemn the rioters. I still do. I think there's no excuse for burning vehicles. I think it's brainless. I think it's pathetic. And I think those people should have been punished. But it would be wrong to say it came out of nothing. There was anger about illegal immigration. Um, there was of course, a false information that the attackers in Southport, the attacker was a Muslim, and that, of course, was false. Um, Anyone who wants to excuse those riots should be ashamed of themselves. Innocent people suffered as a result. But like I say, it didn't come out of nothing. Um, I think that the justice establishment sort of has this idea that the public will complain, but they'll put up with it. And that is another point. If the public don't make some effort to actually make a change, then it won't change. So if you complain, but you never sign a petition, you never do anything, then it isn't going to change. I see a lot of people saying, "Oh, this is terrible. I'm sick of judges making soft decisions." Well, do something about it. Because when I've seen petitions take off, for some reason, they don't get the traction that seems to reflect popular opinion. They just don't. I mean, where is the massive rally in London against crime? It doesn't seem to exist, and I don't think that's because there isn't real anger out there. I think it's because people don't think there's any point. I'm going to have to wrap this up soon because I've got a lesson very soon. But basically, I think that populism shouldn't be dismissed. Populism in its purest form is simply the democratic will of the people. Now, it's important that people are informed correctly. It's important that demagogues don't lie about what's happening. But I think that either right wing populism or left wing populism, it's not entirely without merit. And as much as I have contempt for certain populist figures and some of the lies and demagoguery they come out with, there is almost always a basis to what they're talking about. So that's why it shouldn't be dismissed. I think if institutions should continue to be complacent about public anger, I'm talking about the justice establishment, I'm talking about the BBC, the government, possibly the monarchy to a lesser extent. I don't think there's the same level of anger there, but I'm a royalist, but there are people that deeply dislike it. But institutions have to listen. They have to listen, and if they don't, public anger will grow. That's a reality. So that's why I say populism shouldn't be simply criticised. It needs to be understood, and sometimes it actually does have merit. I mean, I would say the dividing line with good populism versus bad populism. Good populism is forcing change by saying this is what the public want. It has to happen, and doing it in a peaceful way versus demagoguery, which is inciting violence against anyone. That sort of thing is very, very bad and should be avoided. But I don't think populism is necessarily a bad thing. And like I say, my views on crime are absolutely populist. In the sense that I echo what a lot of people think, and I do believe The justice establishment is in a bubble. Maybe not every individual within it, but too too much of it is detached, and that is just wrong. It has to change. I'm going to wrap this up, but let me know your thoughts on populism. I don't entirely dismiss it, and I don't think anyone should, because it is not entirely without basis. Of course, it can be abused. You get demagogues that lie, incite, but populism is not entirely without basis. Like I say, in its purest form, it really is just democracy, absolute democracy. That's what it is.